What if the secret to surviving today's sky-high prices was already discovered nearly 90 years ago by a woman who had nothing left to lose? Picture this. It's 1932, and a mother named Margaret is standing in her Kansas kitchen, staring at an empty pantry, two hungry children clinging to her dress, and exactly 11 cents to her name. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. She reached into a worn leather notebook and opened a handwritten list of habits that would feed her family for the next 3 years without a single dollar of debt. That notebook was never published. It was never sold. It was passed down, daughter to daughter, quietly, until now. If you've ever felt the squeeze of rising grocery bills, inflated gas prices, and a paycheck that just doesn't stretch anymore, you need to see what Margaret knew. Because what she discovered wasn't a trick. It wasn't luck. It was a survival system that helped ordinary families endure one of the hardest economic periods in American history. Subscribe, hit the like button, and stay until the very end, because the final secret is the one habit that could completely change how you handle money forever.
Susan had done everything right. She had a good job, a modest house in Ohio, 2 kids in school, and a savings account she was genuinely proud of. She clipped coupons on Sundays. She tracked her spending in a little blue notebook. She thought she had it figured out. But then the grocery bills started climbing. Then the electric bill. Then the gas. Then the rent on her storage unit doubled overnight. Susan sat at her kitchen table one evening, calculator in hand, and realized something terrifying. She was spending more money than ever before, and somehow had less to show for it. She wasn't buying fancy things. She wasn't splurging on vacations. She was just trying to live a normal American life, and it was costing her everything she had saved. She opened her phone and started searching for answers. That's when she stumbled onto something strange. A Reddit thread buried deep in a personal finance forum. Someone had posted scanned images of a handwritten journal from the 1930s. The journal belonged to Dorothy. Dorothy had lived through the Great Depression in rural Tennessee, raised 4 children, kept a garden, repaired everything she owned, and never once asked anyone for help. Her journal was meticulous, detailed, almost obsessive. Every cent tracked, every scrap saved, every meal stretched. Susan sat at that table until 2 in the morning, reading every word. By the time she went to bed, something had shifted inside her. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but she knew she had to learn more.
The first thing Dorothy wrote about in her journal was something so simple that modern financial experts never talk about it. Cash. Physical, paper cash. Not a debit card, not a digital wallet, not a tap-to-pay phone. Just folded bills and heavy coins carried in a small cotton pouch she kept tucked inside her apron pocket. Dorothy wrote, "When I hold the money in my hands, I feel its weight. When it is gone, I know it is gone. There is no confusion." Susan read that line 3 times. She thought about her own spending, the mindless taps on her debit card, the one-click purchases online, the automatic subscriptions she'd almost forgotten about. Research published in behavioral economics journals confirms what Dorothy figured out by necessity. People spend significantly more when they use cards versus cash, because the physical act of handing over money activates a different kind of awareness in the brain. It actually feels like a loss. That friction, that tiny moment of hesitation, is exactly what stops impulsive purchases. Susan decided to try it. She withdrew her grocery budget in cash on Monday morning. She divided it into small envelopes labeled groceries, gas, household, and emergency. She drove to the store with only the grocery envelope. Something happened in that store that had never happened before. She put 3 things back on the shelf. 3 things she would have bought without thinking if she'd had a card in her hand. She stood in the checkout line, counted her bills carefully, and walked out feeling something unexpected. She felt proud, small but powerful, like Dorothy. Dorothy's journal had a phrase she repeated throughout its pages, almost like a mantra. She wrote it in capital letters at the top of a full page, right in the middle of the journal, surrounded by nothing else. It said, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." Susan read it out loud in the quiet of her kitchen and felt something deep inside her shift. This wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was a complete philosophy of life, a psychological framework for resisting the endless consumer pressure that modern American culture pours into every screen, every billboard, every text message. The use it up rule meant that nothing in Dorothy's house was discarded until it was genuinely, completely finished. A bar of soap was used until it was a sliver, then that sliver was pressed into the next bar. A tube of toothpaste was cut open and scraped clean. Bread that had gone stale was turned into breadcrumbs or bread pudding, never thrown away. Clothes with holes were patched, not tossed. Susan looked around her own house and felt a quiet wave of shame wash over her. She counted 3 items under her bathroom sink she had replaced before they were finished, simply because she'd seen something new on sale. She found 4 half-used bottles of conditioner. She found 2 jars of face cream, both about 30% full, buried behind newer purchases. The waste was invisible when it was spread across a year of small decisions, but when she stood there and added it up, she realized she had thrown away hundreds of dollars she never even noticed losing. Dorothy never lost a dollar she didn't have to lose. Susan decided she wouldn't either.
The kitchen was Dorothy's command center, and her journal treated it like a battlefield. Every ingredient was a soldier with a mission. Nothing was wasted, nothing sat idle. Every part of every food item had a purpose, a use, and a plan before it was even purchased. Dorothy wrote about something she called nose-to-tail cooking for vegetables, long before it became a trend in fashionable restaurants. The tops of carrots became soup stock. The stems of kale were sautéed with garlic. Potato peels were dried and baked into crispy snacks. Bones from a Sunday chicken were boiled for 3 hours into a rich broth that became the base of meals for an entire week. Susan had grown up in a household where her own mother threw away onion skins, vegetable trimmings, and leftover rice without a second thought. It never seemed like waste because each individual item was small. But Susan started keeping a pot in her freezer, a stock pot, just like Dorothy described. Every vegetable scrap went in, every herb stem, every Parmesan rind, every chicken bone. At the end of the week, she made stock, rich, golden, deeply flavored stock that would have cost her $12 at Whole Foods. It cost her nothing. She started tracking what she saved. In the first month alone, her grocery bill dropped by $63, not because she was buying less, but because she was wasting less. Dorothy had known this truth all along. The money isn't lost at the store, it's lost in the trash can. There was a section in Dorothy's journal that Susan almost skipped over, thinking it wouldn't apply to her modern life. It was titled simply "The Cellar."
Dorothy described her root cellar in loving detail. The cool earthen smell, the rows of glass jars lined up like soldiers, the satisfaction of knowing that no matter what happened outside those walls, her family would eat. She canned tomatoes in August. She preserved peaches and plums. She put up green beans, corn, and pickled cucumbers. She dried herbs from her garden and stored them in paper envelopes labeled in her careful handwriting. She kept a written inventory pinned to the cellar door, updated every single week. Susan didn't have a root cellar. She had a pantry closet in her suburban Columbus home, but the principle was the same. She started small, a few jars of homemade jam, some pickled jalapenos, dried pasta bought in bulk on sale. Then she learned to water bath can tomatoes from YouTube tutorials. Then she grew herbs in pots on her windowsill: basil, thyme, rosemary, oregano. By the end of summer, she had a pantry that looked nothing like the empty, sparse shelves from the year before. More importantly, she had a buffer, a real tangible buffer between her family and the next price spike, the next supply chain disruption, the next grocery store panic. She thought about the empty shelves she'd seen during the early days of COVID. She thought about her friends who had scrambled and panicked. She felt, for the first time in years, genuinely secure. Dorothy had felt that security every time she walked into her cellar. Now Susan understood exactly why. Dorothy had a chapter in her journal that she titled "The Power of the Penny," and when Susan first read it, she almost laughed. She thought it would be something old-fashioned and irrelevant, advice about literally saving pennies in a jar, but it wasn't that at all. Dorothy wrote about something far more sophisticated, the psychology of micro-savings, and how tiny, consistent actions compound into real financial security over time. She described a habit she called the daily coin. Every single day, without fail, Dorothy set aside whatever she could, sometimes a quarter, sometimes a nickel, sometimes literally just a penny, into a separate tin box kept on the highest shelf of her kitchen. She never touched it, she never counted it in her regular budget. She called it invisible money. And when the tin was full, she wrapped the coins carefully in paper rolls and deposited them at the bank, but never ever spent them on day-to-day needs. Those coins were her emergency fund. Those coins eventually paid for her youngest daughter's school shoes in the winter of 1934, when her husband's work dried up completely for 3 months. Susan thought about the modern equivalent. She set up a micro-savings account that automatically transferred $3 a day, just $3, from her checking account into a separate high-yield savings account she nicknamed the Tin. She never looked at it, she never included it in her regular budget. 4 months later, she checked the balance. She had saved $360 without feeling a thing. It wasn't going to make her rich, but it was $360 that hadn't existed before. And just like Dorothy's penny tin, it was there, waiting for when she needed it most. The section of Dorothy's journal that surprised Susan most was the one about waste. Not food waste, but household waste, the kind of waste that modern Americans create without ever thinking about it. Cardboard boxes, glass jars, old newspapers, worn-out cotton shirts, rubber bands, twist ties, bread bags, buttons clipped from clothes too worn to wear anymore. Dorothy kept all of it, organized in a series of labeled tins and cloth bags on a shelf in her utility room, and she used every single piece. Cardboard became fire starter and garden mulch. Glass jars became food storage, drinking glasses, and candle holders. Old shirts became cleaning rags, then eventually compost. Rubber bands and twist ties were reused dozens of times before they finally broke. Susan read this and felt a wave of genuine cultural disorientation.
She realized that in the past 30 days, she had spent money on paper towels, plastic storage bags, and cleaning cloths, all items that Dorothy would have never needed to buy because she made or repurposed everything. Susan bought a set of cotton rags from a thrift store and put away the paper towels. She started saving glass jars, pasta sauce jars, pickle jars, and jam jars, and using them for food storage, leftover soups, and homemade salad dressings. She started a small compost bin in the corner of her backyard. It was messy, it was a little inconvenient, and it was saving her more money every month than she had expected, because she was finally seeing all the hidden costs she'd been paying without realizing it. Zero-waste living, it turned out, wasn't a trend. It was a habit that Depression-era Americans had perfected out of sheer necessity.
There was a neighbor named Helen that Dorothy wrote about often in her journal. Helen was practical, sharp, and had a large vegetable garden, a talent for sewing, and an old sewing machine that still worked perfectly. Dorothy had none of those things, but she had preserved peaches, homemade bread, and a talent for pickling. And so they traded, regularly, quietly, without money changing hands. Dorothy would bring Helen a jar of peach preserves. Helen would bring Dorothy a bushel of green beans from her garden. Dorothy would give Helen 3 loaves of fresh bread. Helen would patch the knees of Dorothy's children's pants. It wasn't charity. It wasn't a formal arrangement. It was community. It was the original sharing economy, practiced with dignity and mutual respect. Susan thought about her own neighborhood in Columbus. She thought about her neighbor Patricia, who had an enormous zucchini garden every summer and always jokingly complained that she couldn't give the zucchinis away fast enough. She thought about her friend Linda, who was an excellent seamstress and had once offered to hem Susan's curtains but had never been taken up on the offer. Susan began to think differently about the people around her. She brought Patricia a bottle of homemade hot sauce made from her windowsill chili plants. Patricia brought over 12 zucchinis and a bag of cherry tomatoes. Susan made zucchini bread, which she shared with Linda. Linda repaired the zipper on Susan's winter coat, which would have cost $40 at the dry cleaner. No money had changed hands, but real value had been exchanged. Real relationships had deepened, and real money had been saved. Dorothy's journal contained a passage about a pair of boots that stopped Susan cold. Dorothy described how her husband's work boots had worn through at the sole in the winter of 1933. New boots cost money they did not have, so Dorothy's husband resoled them himself with a piece of thick leather cut from an old belt, rubber adhesive made from tree sap, and careful hand stitching with a curved needle he'd kept since the war. Those boots lasted 2 more years. Dorothy wrote, "We do not throw away a thing simply because it is broken. A broken thing is a puzzle to be solved." Susan sat with that sentence for a long time. She thought about the toaster she had thrown away last year, the one that simply had a loose wire. She thought about her daughter Emily's bicycle, donated to Goodwill because one gear wouldn't shift properly. She thought about the blender that had stopped working, which she had replaced with a brand new model without ever looking up whether it could be repaired. She started small. Her son's sneaker had a sole that was beginning to peel. Instead of buying a new pair, she bought a tube of shoe repair adhesive, $3 at the hardware store, and fixed it herself. The sneaker held for another 6 months. She found a local repair cafe, a concept she'd never heard of before, a community space where volunteers help people repair broken items for free. She brought in a lamp, a toaster, and a handheld mixer. All 3 were fixed. All 3 were working again. She had saved herself close to $200 in replacements. Mending, she was learning, was not just thrift, it was intelligence. There was a page in Dorothy's journal that was different from all the others. It was a page of numbers, just numbers, small, careful, precise handwriting arranged in columns, the date, the item, the amount. Every cent that Dorothy spent or saved was accounted for on these pages. The entries went back years. Some days the entries were tiny, matches, 1 cent. Some days they were bigger, flour, 25 cents. But every single day had an entry. Every single day was accounted for. Dorothy called these pages her emergency ledger, and she wrote that keeping it was not about anxiety or fear, it was about clarity. When I know where every cent goes, she wrote, I am never surprised. When I am never surprised, I am never afraid. Susan thought about her own relationship with money. She realized she had not balanced her checkbook in over a year. She paid bills automatically and trusted that everything would work out, checking her account balance only when she had a vague, uncomfortable feeling that something was off. She downloaded a simple budgeting app and spent one Sunday afternoon entering every expense from the past 3 months. What she found stunned her. She had spent $412 on subscription services, most of which she either didn't use or had forgotten about entirely. She had spent $219 on coffee shop visits. She had spent $340 on impulse purchases made through her phone while she was lying in bed at night. The numbers were not shameful, they were illuminating. They were, finally, honest. She felt the same thing Dorothy must have felt, staring at her own ledger in 1932. Clarity. And with clarity, for the first time in a long time, real control. Dorothy had a quiet philosophy about her home that ran through the journal like a thread. She never wrote about it directly, never named it, but Susan noticed it in the way Dorothy described her small Tennessee farmhouse. Dorothy never seemed to want more space. She never lamented the size of her kitchen or the smallness of her bedroom. She organized, she decluttered, she kept every room functional and clean, and she seemed genuinely at peace with the life that fit inside those 4 walls. Susan thought about the conversations she heard constantly among her friends about upgrading, upsizing, moving to a bigger house in a better neighborhood, getting a second bathroom, adding a home office. The real estate market had become a kind of obsession, a measuring stick for personal success. And yet the women she heard talking about bigger houses always seemed to be the ones who were also the most stressed, the most in debt, the most exhausted. The desire for more space had become a trap, a beautiful, well-marketed trap. Susan looked at her own 3-bedroom home with new eyes. She reorganized her garage. She cleared out the guest room that had become a storage room. She repainted the kitchen a warm cream color for $40 worth of paint. Her home felt bigger after she removed what she didn't need. It felt warmer. It felt like enough. Dorothy had known something crucial, that contentment is not a compromise, it is an achievement. It takes real discipline and real wisdom to look at what you have and decide consciously and with full awareness that it is enough. That decision, Susan was realizing, was the most radical financial act of all. Dorothy described something in her journal that she called the waiting cure. Whenever she felt the urge to buy something, anything, she wrote the item down in a small pocket notebook she carried everywhere. Then she waited. She waited 1 week, sometimes 2. And most of the time, when she came back to that item on the list and read it again, the desire had faded. The urgency had dissolved. She realized she had wanted it, not needed it. And in that distinction,
In the space between want and need, she saved money she couldn't afford to spend. Susan thought about the online shopping cart she kept perpetually full. She thought about the Instagram ads she clicked, the Amazon recommendations that always seemed to know exactly what she was slightly interested in, the emails from stores she'd shopped at once that arrived daily with flash sales and limited-time offers. The entire modern retail system was engineered to collapse the distance between desire and purchase, to eliminate the waiting cure that Dorothy had used instinctively. Susan decided to bring the waiting cure back. She created a folder in her phone's Notes app and named it Want List. Before she bought anything non-essential, she wrote it there first. She had to wait 7 days before she could buy it. At the end of 1 month, she reviewed the list. 31 items. She had purchased exactly 4 of them. 27 seemed unnecessary, embarrassing even, by the time she came back to them. She had, without trying very hard, saved herself somewhere between $300 and $500 in a single month just by waiting.
Dorothy's journal had extensive notes about her pantry, the stockpile, she called it, though in a Depression-era context, that word carried weight that modern preppers have almost co-opted and distorted beyond recognition. Dorothy's stockpile wasn't about fear, it was about patience and strategy. She bought staples in bulk whenever she found them at reduced prices: flour, sugar, dried beans, oats, salt, vinegar, lard. She bought extra when she had a little extra. She never let staples run out if she could help it. And she rotated everything, first in, first out, so nothing expired or went to waste. She wrote, "A full pantry is a calm mind. When my pantry is full, I do not worry about tomorrow's price." Susan began building her own version of Dorothy's strategic pantry. She started with the basics: a 50-pound bag of rice, a 20-pound bag of dried black beans, oats in a large canister, extra salt, sugar, olive oil, and a variety of canned goods bought in bulk from Costco when they were on sale. She didn't do it all at once. She spent an extra $20 per grocery trip specifically directed at building the pantry reserve. Within 3 months, she had a pantry that could feed her family comfortably for at least 6 weeks, without a single emergency shopping trip. When inflation pushed the price of pasta up 30% the following spring, Susan didn't feel it. She had bought her pasta months earlier, at the old price.